Thank you, Anne-Marie, for the warm welcome, and also to President Jim Kim for bringing to this week the attention of the Chief Executive. My great pleasure is to be here today at the invitation of the World Bank team for the Law, Justice and Development Week to speak not only about climate change in the context of the process and of Marrakesh, but rather that was the topic that I was given, the takeaways from Marrakesh. I will try and frame my remarks both in the context of the Paris Agreement and what President Jim Yong Kim just alluded to, its historical watershed moment that it represents. I will try and echo to some of the certainly nervousness, volatility, and to some extent unknown implications of elections, of political changes, not only here but in different parts of the world, and the kind of political and economic signals that we can read or perhaps not yet read into things that will unfold. But principally, I will also look at this question, since we are here at the Law, Justice and Development Week, of the context within which jurisprudence, climate change and law, but also the recourse to law and the judiciary system will become an increasingly important and central part of progressing how nations, societies, but also legal entities across our economy will take up the issue of climate change, by virtue of it not just being a technological, scientific or economic issue, but indeed increasingly an issue defined by fundamental rights and by the recourse to justice. And therefore, the topic of this week remains as relevant as ever: law and justice in the context of development. Now, let me briefly give you my interpretation of the takeaways from Marrakesh. And I will not go into the individual decisions. You know that there were well over 36 decisions taken. It was in some ways the action COP. The idea was that after Paris, having set the stage in Marrakesh, people would get down to the operationalization. Now, clearly, what we can say after Marrakesh is that the Paris Agreement is alive, and it is strong, and it is kicking. You have rarely in the history of multilateralism seen as profound an agreement being ratified by so many countries so quickly and it coming into force that anybody who would today, a year after Paris, still have the lingering doubts that some had when they got on the airplane after the Paris COP had finished, whether this agreement would actually come into life. I think you can certainly take some comfort from the way that countries have not only embraced the agreement but are moving forward with it. Secondly, the signal from the Paris Agreement is crystal clear. It points towards decarbonization of our economies. Now, how and in what kind of time scale and with increasing levels of ambition this will be accomplished or is accomplishable will remain part of the process that the Paris Agreement has essentially created the pathway for. But there can be no doubt, including if we think back to the G7 summit in Elmore last year, where the notion of decarbonization was for the first time made an official part of the communiqué. What Paris represents is the signal into the economy, into national legislatures, that decarbonization with a view towards a pathway somewhere around the middle of this century is the leading driver of what happens next. But, and I think here Marrakesh also pointed to this constant pendulum. International processes can advance issues, then the pendulum has to swing back to the national level. It is where political legitimacy, it is where economic strategy and also the specificity of people and issues of equity and transition become real in terms of real decisions, real consequences. So I do believe that Marrakesh also signaled that while we have the Paris Agreement and it will continue to be the locomotive, if you want, that drives climate action at a global level, the focus is shifting to the national level. That is where implementation now needs to be agreed in terms of ambition. That's where political uncertainty needs to be addressed, including ambivalent signals to the economy. It's also where citizens will increasingly conduct a debate about whether the desirability of decarbonization is not only something we should aim for, but that it is actually realistically doable and without destroying economies or jobs or livelihoods or the competitiveness of economies. Marrakesh, I think, will also be remembered as a moment where leadership roles at the global level began to evolve in an explicit way and changing. They have done so for a number of years, but there is no doubt in my mind that from Marrakesh onwards, for instance, the leadership role that the so-called G2 have played will change. The United States and China, in the way that they came together in enabling the Paris Agreement to happen, with many others playing equally important and central roles, will change inevitably as a result of the last few weeks. I think we will see already in the statements and in the actions that are being taken by China that it does see itself assuming a greater responsibility in a global context, but also with its national domestic policy context for enabling the Paris Agreement and the process associated with it, not only at the national level, which has been its focus for the past 15 to 20 years in climate change terms, but also in its global context as significantly shifting and evolving. Europe's next steps are also going to be defining in terms of the momentum, but I think we will see Europe not walk away from its vitally important catalytic role that it has played over the last 20 years in the global climate process. And notwithstanding a lot of the national noise that is now manifesting itself across Europe, its own, in a sense, introspection, on the climate change front, I do believe that Europe will maintain its leadership because part of its future economic success is premised on actually being at the forefront of an innovation curve when it comes to its economies in the climate and decarbonization context. But then there is also the continent of Africa. Many still look at Africa as the victim of climate change, and quite rightly so. That continent really has, in terms of its nations and its people, the least responsibility for the problems we face today. But what happens next in Africa will actually define our capacity to collectively respond to climate change. On a continent with now 1 billion people, and in 30 to 40 years' time, 2 billion people, there will be an additional 1.3 billion people joining the grids and electricity consumption matrices of the world. This is the equivalent in sheer numbers of China joining the global economy and the global energy economy in just 2 to 3 decades. So decisions that African nations, leaders, societies and economies will take about their energy pathways, their transport infrastructure, their agricultural economies and how their cities will develop will become a central part of determining whether a Paris Agreement and the objectives of 1.5, 2 degree scenarios remain viable and realistic. And the world needs to appreciate this much more clearly, because my concern remains that in an international context, Africa is not recognized as a central player in determining the outcome of the Paris Agreement. It is still seen as a nation, a group of nations that need to be assisted, and that perhaps in the climate justice context need to be also looked at as a group of nations and peoples that require solidarity. We need to sharpen our focus far more clearly, and this is also where the World Bank, the regional development banks, and the international economic institutions, including those in the energy sectors, need to look at leadership roles evolving very rapidly. And back to China, and back to the global south, which today is actually the dominant driver in the economy of renewables. These are realities that point to, beyond Marrakesh, a very different landscape of leaders and also of those who are setting the agenda. Let me acknowledge that in Marrakesh we also made some progress in terms of moving into action, the operationalization of the Paris Agreement, writing the rule book. The pathways have been laid out. Some left Marrakesh hoping for more, but I think we can take enough comfort from the fact that negotiators are quite clear of what needs to be done. They have set timelines and the process is underway, particularly with 2018 in mind. Another takeaway from Marrakesh is the pre-2020 actions. And here I want to point beyond that which national authorities through their climate change policies and plans have already signaled, and point to something that was quite self-evident in Marrakesh, was already visible in Paris and even in Lima, that the drivers of pre-2020 action are increasingly actually moving at the level of subnational authorities, cities, businesses. This is where the innovation curve is driving opportunity, and we need to appreciate, understand, and not underestimate the importance in national public policy making of enabling that momentum to be harnessed and to be leveraged, and not to take it for granted or simply to dismiss it as the pioneers that are not relevant to the larger game. Corporate decisions are now significantly influencing an entire market of technology, for instance, for renewables. And if you look at the largest investors in renewable energy, they are, after a few national state authorities, actually companies. Amazon, Google are amongst the largest corporate investors in the world today in renewable energy. And they're not talking about 1 or 2 megawatts. No, we're talking about dozens, in some cases even over 100 megawatts of renewable energy capacity being commissioned, purchased in the market of investors who are driving technology, and with it the economies of scale and prices. So we need to appreciate that pre-2020 and certainly following 2020, the role of the corporate world and of markets will in significant ways determine the capacity to accelerate, which in turn translates into whether ambition, which is the inbuilt DNA of the Paris Agreement, over time will actually begin to unfold. Let me point to another aspect that I think is important in terms of pre-2020 and post-2020. Perhaps not sufficiently appreciated by the international community. A few weeks ago in Rwanda, in its capital Kigali, the Montreal Protocol achieved yet another extraordinary milestone and breakthrough. The Kigali Amendment, which addresses the issue of HFCs, is potentially the equivalent of having taken half a degree out of global warming in terms of a business-as-usual scenario. It is actually the single largest action that states have taken in terms of bending the curve. It is quite remarkable that this treaty, which is in many respects the most successful environmental treaty that we have, has now been taken up by member states in synchronicity with the Climate Change Convention to deal with yet another front line of where action is possible, and where agreement has been brokered through extraordinary efforts by the Secretariat, by individual member states, and by the scientific community, and increasingly now the business community offering alternatives. So do not underestimate, I think, out of Marrakesh, what can happen between now and 2020 and how that translates into the capacity to act beyond that. A final takeaway from Marrakesh. Finance. President Jim Yong-King just alluded to it, and I will go further and say financial markets. We face an enormous challenge in persuading countries, communities, business leaders, and the financial sector, never mind the public, that this notion of decarbonizing our economies is something that we can actually afford to do. And this is principally not located in the context of global north-south finance and transfer and ODA and the Green Climate Fund. These I take almost as givens, because it would be close to an act of bad faith not to fulfill the commitment of the 100 billion. And I am convinced that within a few years' time, the sheer notion of self-interest will make this $100 billion investment, and let me call it investment, not transfer, by industrialized countries in the capacity of developing nations to accelerate their own transition and decarbonization, very much part of a global economic rationale of working together. But much more fundamental will be what happens at the national level. Are we actually able to mobilize what in most countries will be the determining factor, namely financial markets, investors and funds, be they pension funds, hedge funds, technology investors, to actually embrace this notion of decarbonization and the technology choices that go with it? So far, the financial markets and our financial institutions have proven what they have often proven in the past. that they, yes, can find opportunities, but they are not the most efficient accelerators between where technology and science provides opportunities and where markets actually invest their funds. Because inherently, financial markets are risk averse, strange as that may seem in the context of the events of the last 5 to 10 years. And we have not seen the financial institutions of the world taking their potential roll-up in the context of what the Paris Agreement actually implies, which is trillions of dollars making different technology choices, different development infrastructure choices, different bets on the future of our energy, transport, agriculture economies. It is a fundamental shift that we are looking for. And I believe that this notion of green finance, and I'm delighted to see Jim referring to that, because as some of you may know, this is an area in which the United Nations Environment Programme, many other organizations in the last few years have invested a great deal of time trying to figure out how can we, through the role of central banks, financial regulatory authorities, the legislative environment, create the incentives that will lead finance to invest in the enabling technologies and infrastructure that make a low-carbon economy not only feasible in potential terms, but unfold in actual investments on the ground. Now here, I think just the last few months have given us reason to be far more hopeful than we would have been perhaps 1 or 2 years ago. And it is in part through some of its own analysis in China, through the People's Bank of China, that we have seen just in the last few months China adopt guidelines to green its financial sector out of a very pragmatic and practical realization that in order to mobilize the $300 billion plus it will need in its own assessment for green finance annually, perhaps 20% of that will come through public government budgets, not different from most countries. And therefore 70 to 80% of this capital will have to be raised through the financial markets. And if they don't respond, then the equation doesn't work. I think the adoption of these guidelines on financing on greening China's financial system will perhaps in a few years' time prove to be one of the more profound regulatory signals to change the outlook on our financial markets. And the fact that China took this discussion straight into the G20 also echoes to the fact that in the context of the G20, it sees itself playing an important role, one that also the German presidency has now also taken over in terms of the study group on green finance continuing. So the signal to the financial markets, to investors, to fund managers, I think is likely to shift significantly, not in 5 to 10 year time cycles, but literally over the next 24 to 36 months, which again, I would consider to be one of the takeaways from Marrakesh, perhaps more in terms of speculating forward than being able to say with certainty this will happen. So what happens next? Well, the UNFCCC process will continue. The IPCC is working towards its 1.5 degree report. The focus will, as I have said, move towards the national level. That's where national plans in terms of ambition, uncertainty, will now have to be worked out. That's where real decisions are taken and where legitimacy and the authority to act will be defined by whether economic players, voters, the public are willing to follow. Signals from some countries, for example, Germany with its new climate change plan, are very promising. The United States, notwithstanding some of the uncertainty that is now part of what happens next in the United States, again in Marrakesh presented very ambitious plans. We are talking about concrete pathways to decarbonizing sectors. I currently chair a council in Germany about a transport and mobility transition in Germany's economy, analogous to its Energiewende, its energy transition. And I can tell you that the automotive industry, federal, state-level governments and interest and stakeholder organizations have formed this council because Germany's climate change plan now is calling for a 40% reduction in emissions from its transport sector by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, this is equivalent to a technology leap. There is no other way that this will be accomplishable, and this is why even in the bastion of the combustion engine, the German automotive industry, there is now very serious thought being given to that era beyond the combustion engine, and what will actually determine the technology choices and opportunities for mobility in the 21st century. In part, this is coinciding also with autonomous driving technology, with changing patterns of mobility and demand in the marketplace. So a great deal of upheaval in a sector that is, as you know, fundamental to moving forward. The acceleration, in part, will also be determined by what happens next in the economy and the markets. We are living in times where, with every political news item, markets are moving through a period of great uncertainty. The worst thing that can happen to the Paris Climate Agreement is a kind of freezing or paralysis in the financial markets and in the sectors that actually determine whether investment looking forward is a proposition worth pursuing. So we do have to significantly look towards trying to get the narrative between where the political signals are, in a sense, very diverse, but where the fundamentals allow economic decision makers to detect a clear pathway into the next 10 to 15 years. Finally, what happens next will also depend on things that are very difficult to predict, the unknown, the climate signals, the droughts, the floods, the extreme weather events. And again, who can predict how quickly public opinion will move from one end of the equation to the other? Let me end my comments this morning by focusing for a moment on the specific role of law, the judiciary, and this notion of justice. There is in my mind no question that we will see the issues of rule of law, the courts, the judiciary, and climate change take an ever more central role. Whether it is in reference to international treaties, commitments, or just international law, whether it is in terms of national legislation and how it corresponds to international law, or whether it is in terms of constitutional law, the ability and the willingness and the propensity of the public, whether it is in terms of citizens, whether it is in terms of class action suits, or whether it is in terms of actors in the economy, to seek judiciary recourse in trying to address the issue of climate change in terms of decisions being taken by our governments, is already becoming very much a part of our societies. Indeed, countries have realized that the whole notion of the environmental rule of law, in part accelerated in its development by the climate change challenge, is giving rise to an environmental jurisprudence that is complex, challenged by the science and the technology and the difficulty of the normal judicial process to cope with this. It is one reason why we have seen this explosion of environmental courts and tribunals, and I just want to point you to a report that UNEP has just released on environmental courts and tribunals, I think last week, which is an excellent overview of what is happening. We are literally looking now at over 1,200 environmental courts and tribunals worldwide, and this is a sample from a limited number of countries. These are specialized courts that countries are putting in place in order to deal with decision-making and challenges in terms of constitutional law, in terms of international treaty law, or just in terms of challenges in national law and legislation. Litigation, whether on the back of projects, of policies, or class action suits, will, I believe, become increasingly part of the effort of societies to try and reconcile these extremely difficult choices and, as some would call them, trade-offs. I would prefer if trade-off was not the actual equation with which we look at this issue. Let me just point briefly to the fact that, to those who still think this is an abstract notion, it is by no means so. The link also between human rights law, environmental law, and climate change is one that has profoundly changed in the last few years. Whether it is in terms of fundamental rights, the right to life, right to health, healthy environments, they are enshrined in over 180 national constitutions today. They are being invoked in the supreme courts of many countries across the globe, north and south, large and small, in the green tribunals of India, or in the high courts of Brazil, or indeed in cases that are now being brought, for instance, in the Netherlands, which you are aware of, in Belgium, where over 9,000 co-plaintiffs are taking government to court over its climate change policy, or whether in Pakistan over the Ashgar Lekhan case, which again challenged the policies of government in addressing climate change in terms of fundamental rights that courts are there to defend and increasingly having to interpret against the backdrop of an unprecedented phenomenon called climate change. The Oslo Principles on Global Obligations to Reduce Climate Change were one attempt last year to give expression to some of the legal foundations and principles that will guide the further articulation of this relationship between rights, law, justice, constitutional law, and what happens next in our courts. We will also see new concepts emerge in jurisprudence along the lines of equity, particularly when it comes to intergenerational equity. Rio principles and even the Sustainable Development Goals are now being cited in national jurisprudence as reference points for interpreting constitutional provisions about fundamental rights. And in sustainability terms, partly through also the discourse that has been led by IUCN, UNEP, the Environmental Law Commission, and many practitioners, in particular its chair of the IUCN Environmental Law Commission, Antonio Benjamin, a justice of the High Court of Brazil, new concepts will emerge such as in dubio pro natura. What does this mean? That in case of doubt, your ruling will have to be in favor of nature, not against people, which is very often the interpretation, but in cases of doubt, the notion of the precautionary principle is in the process of being articulated in a very different context. And I think we will see a great deal of change. So let me end my keynote this morning by saying to you, notwithstanding, and they are very real signals that point to a difficult landscape ahead of us in political terms, the economic, the national and international security dimension, but above all, the recognition by virtually every country on this planet that if they do not succeed collectively to take the Paris Agreement forward, everybody will be a loser. That foundation, I believe, after Marrakesh has proven itself to be not a wishful one, but actually a very real one. Individual countries, individual sectors and actors may take a step back, may take a step sideways, but I would say to you with the full conviction of somebody who now has the privilege of not having to be a UN official, but actually sitting in the University of Oxford with my colleagues and in the Oxford Martin School, looking at that landscape across science, economy and politics, that indeed on this occasion of the Law, Justice and Development Week here in Washington at the World Bank in 2016, rest assured, the Paris Agreement is here to stay. And I think we will see extraordinary developments happening, not in the next 20 years, but already over the next 5 to 10 years, that will prove its capacity to actually accelerate efforts and give hope as much as expression to the notion of justice and fundamental rights that are implied in its provisions. Thank you very much.